Let's talk about leukopoiesis, or white blood cell production. Leukopoiesis is one portion of hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis being just blood cell production in general, leukopoiesis being white blood cell production. So I have a question to start out with. Which of these white blood cell types provides specific immunity? And so specific immunity, let's think about that. That's when a cell specifically recognizes what it is that it's attacking. In other words, it's not just phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is the general ability to engulf something that's foreign. This white blood cell doesn't have to specifically recognize that. So knowing that, we know that neutrophils are general phagocytes, right? And so that's not specific immunity. Monocytes are general phagocytes. Those also will engulf anything. They're not picky. Eosinophils are secretory, and they attack large parasites or immune complexes and then use general phagocytosis to get rid of that debris. Basophils are primarily secretory, right? They secrete heparin and histamine. And that leaves us with the lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are the one type of white blood cell that provides specific immunity. Lymphocytes produce antibodies, which have to be specifically directed against a pathogen. Lymphocytes can also attack virus-infected cells. This is a picture of hematopoiesis. So going with the question that we just thought through, how lymphocytes are so different, let's take a look at this. We know with hematopoiesis that there's one stem cell, the hemocytoblast, that will give rise to all of the other cell types. But take a look at early on in the bone marrow, this hemocytoblast must decide, it must differentiate into either a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. It must make that decision right away. It must take path A or path B. So if the hemocytoblast does differentiate into a myeloid stem cell, let's take a look at what happens to it. Myeloid stem cells can give rise to platelets. They can also turn into red blood cells. They could also turn into 4 of the 5 different types of white blood cells: basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and monocytes. If the hemocytoblast, on the other hand, differentiates into a lymphoid stem cell, only those cells can turn into lymphocytes. And you can see that the special function of lymphocytes providing specific immunity starts very early on in the differentiation of that type of cell. You might wonder what would cause a hemocytoblast to differentiate into a white blood cell or any given type of white blood cell versus a red blood cell or a platelet. Remember that we talked about the fact that red blood cell production is hormonally regulated by erythropoietin, that erythropoietin would be released by the kidney and it would stimulate the hemocytoblast to give rise to red blood cells. And in that same token, there are other chemical messages that will stimulate white blood cell production. There are a category of chemical messengers called colony stimulating factors that stimulate different types of white blood cell production. Interleukin, there are different types of interleukins that can stimulate white blood cell production. And interestingly, these substances can also turn off white blood cell production. So it's very complicated, but I just wanted you to know that when white blood cells are called into action, basically what's going to happen is they're going to release chemical messages that will turn on or turn off white blood cell production at the level of the bone marrow through these substances called colony stimulating factors and interleukins. Let's take a minute to look at the disease leukemia, which is a cancerous condition of white blood cells. Leukemia is when a certain type of white blood cell starts to grow out of control, and because white blood cells are diffuse, instead of forming a solid tumor, what happens is these cells just outnumber the other cells and overcrowd the normal cells. When you look at a diagnosis of leukemia, there are 2 characteristics that they usually include in the name of the diagnosis. One of the characteristics is acute versus chronic. What it means to be an acute leukemia just means that the cell type that's growing out of control is a very early, immature cell, versus chronic means that the cell that's growing out of control is more mature. The other characteristic that they put right in the name of leukemia is what cell line, what stem cell line it came from. So we know all white blood cells come from hemocytoblasts, but remember that hemocytoblasts have to differentiate either into a lymphoid stem cell or a myeloid stem cell. So any leukemia that has the term lymphocytic or lymphoblastic, what that means is that it's the lymphoid stem cell that's growing out of control, compared to a term like myelogenous or myeloid means that it's the myeloid stem cell that's growing out of control. Let's take a look at two different types of leukemia so I can show you what I mean. This is a picture of a peripheral blood smear of acute lymphocytic leukemia. Acute meaning it's a lymphoblast or an early immature cell type that's growing out of control. And we can also see that the cell type that's growing out of control is from the lymphoid cell line. Another example, chronic myelogenous leukemia. Chronic referring to it's a more mature cell type that's growing out of control. And taking a look at the peripheral blood smear, we can see that it's a different cell type that is outnumbering the others. You can see all of the granulocytes and monocytes.